This is Platemark. My name is Ann Shafer, and I am your host. I'm an independent curator specializing in prints and printmaking. You have found me at Platemark Series 3, in which I interview the wonderful people who occupy the print ecosystem. Today's guest is Steve Goddard, who retired not too long ago as a curator from the Spencer Museum of Art at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. Now, listeners may not really understand exactly what is out there in Lawrence, but they have an incredible collection, and they have a very, very active study center that engages students across disciplines in the university, not just art history and studio art. So language students or students in the sciences, you name it. Steve was a curator there for 34 years and was much beloved by all. He was so, in fact, that the study center in the museum is now named for him. I wanted to talk to him because he is the kind of professor/curator who I think is the person who affected a number of people to become art historians or printmakers themselves. You know, I have a professor from college who was the person who got me hooked. Steve is that person for so many people. So I wanted to talk to him. Okay, housekeeping. I identify as a cishet white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. I record this in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. You will find images that Steve and I talk about over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. Head on over there. You'll also find a little microphone icon, which will allow you to leave a 60-second voicemail for me. You can ask a question or leave a comment. Would love to hear from you. Also over there is a button that says support and donate. It's just me over here keeping the lights on at Platemark, even though I have serious help from other people like True and Ben. But it is just me, and we would love to have your support. You can hit that button and choose one of two things. You can support us on a monthly basis at $5, or you can elect to give a one-time donation that you determine the amount of. All right, I think that's it. Buckle up, and here we go. Steve, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for coming on Platemark. I so appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, I reached out to you because, as listeners will know, your name comes up frequently. So I thought, let's just go straight to the guy and hear it from the horse's mouth, as it were. Can you introduce yourself for people?
Yeah, sure. I'm Steve Goddard. I was the curator of prints and drawings and later photographs at the Spencer Museum of Art for 35 years, and recently retired. And now living in Estes Park, still active in print studies and to a degree printmaking, print lore in general.
Print lore. Ooh, we haven't talked about print lore. What do you mean by that?
Everything that pertains to printmaking and
Okay.
all the little anecdotes and secrets and tricks and, stories behind the scene.
Are you going to write the book for everybody? I've been wanting for years for somebody to write the book that summarizes the tricks for various artists, like the trick with all of those ridiculous Manet, and all the Goya versions, and the tricks with the Chagalls and the Calders. Are you going to write it?
Nope. I could think of some good people to do it, but I wouldn't be the one.
I know. Maybe we could do a compilation or something because there's so...
Yeah, it might have to be a collaborative effort.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to get that list from you later. Yeah. So print lore. Here we are. You're in the perfect spot because this podcast is all printmaking all the time. Although occasionally people talk about other things like drawings.
Shocking.
Okay. So the Spencer Museum is at the University of Kansas, and it has a fantastic collection. I think probably because of you.
Well, the original gift that really got the collection started was from the Max Kade Foundation, which was a pharmaceutical fortune. And Mr. Kade collected prints. He was from Stuttgart and collected old master prints. And some of them are at Oberlin now. Many of them are at the Spencer, and some are still in Stuttgart. There may be more than that I'm aware of. But the old master collection, the core of the old master collection, the Rembrandts, the Dürers, the Raimondis, etc., came from the Max Kade collection. And it basically gave them an excuse to get serious about printmaking in the museum and to hire a print curator. So I was the first person who was really full-time print curator, though I've been preceded by Elizabeth Brune, Jan Howard, and others. But I came on board largely because the Max Kara Foundation gift justified having a print curator.
Right.
And we built the collection from there, of course, with many gifts and many acquisitions.
Sure. What do you have? Print curators are generalists. We're all generalists, but what's your special interest area?
My doctoral area actually was 16th century Flemish painting,
Oh,
15th and 16th century. Well, that makes sense. I segued from that into, well, actually, I'd always been interested in printmaking. I'd studied it at University of Iowa with Charles Cutler, offered a really great history of print class. And I went on and did Northern Renaissance studies, but then I bounced back into print lore through my internship at Yale University Art Gallery with Dick Field, which was a wonderful year and a wonderful friendship. I guess it's worth saying that I've been involved with printmaking for a very long time, from childhood.
whoa, wait, go
And
back there. Where did that start?
oh, sure. And so the dissertation area was not exactly an anomaly, but it was we have to think of that business of being a scholar of 16th century, 15th century Flemish painting as being embedded in a larger interest of printmaking, which I then returned to through the internship at Yale and then continued professionally at the University of Kansas.
Okay. So you're a maker too, right?
Yeah,
So did you make first and then hit the history of prints later, the print lore later?
it's a longer story, but I studied printmaking at Pasadena City College one summer with Ben Sakaguchi before going to college. This was at a junior college in Pasadena. And then at Grinnell College, I was a major in art, specializing in silversmithing and jewelry, which of course uses burins and has its own connection with history of printmaking. And I made prints there as well. And then I went to Minneapolis College of Art and Design just because I heard Minneapolis was a cool city. So I didn't really have postgraduate plans. I went up there and managed to get a job as an off-campus resident advisor at the College of Art and Design. And it paid almost nothing, literally. It was like $40 a week or $30 a week or something. And I said I'd do it if they would give me free tuition to night school and access to the print studios. And they said, sure. So I worked all that year basically making prints on my own in MCAD. And one of the professors there, Tom Egerman, was kind enough to write me a recommendation to the University of Iowa, where I went next and studied with Mauricio Lazansky in printmaking, started an MFA program there, which I bailed on after a year.
You did?
I did. And then I came back a year later after a year off in art history at University of Iowa, and that's where the rest of it begins.
Okay, so I gotta
And,
ask, what made you drop out of the MFA program?
well, I was paying my own way, and I didn't think I was getting any education. Basically, I mean, it was kind of an internship situation where you went and worked hard, and maybe Lazansky would talk to you after a few years.
Is that right?
Well, and I hope I'm not saying anything out of place, but that was my experience. So I was there for a year, and I made a number of prints, and I learned some things from the people who were the shop administrators. But Lazansky himself really didn't take time with people till they'd been there for a few years. And that was my experience anyway. And I did not feel that since I was paying my own way, I was getting what I wanted out of the program.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Although in retrospect, I got a lot out of the program. But, retrospect is a great thing.
Right. So, but
Yeah.
why did you return to Iowa for the art history?
Well, because I had already started some art history classes.
Ah, okay.
And of course, it had to do with a professor. His name was Stephen Foster,
Hmm.
and he was a Dada expert. And I had been really captivated by his lectures on 20th century modernism, especially Dada. And I wrote to him, I said, I'm thinking of coming back to school. Would you consider me as a student in your graduate program? And he wrote back and said, sure. So I applied and got in. And I continued to work with Stephen Foster, who Tim Benson worked with, by the way. You probably know Tim.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were classmates. from there, it was kind of a segue into Northern Renaissance studies with Charles Cutler because I just kind of got the bug for the beautiful Northern paintings.
Yeah,
And
they're
his
gorgeous.
history of Prince class as well was adjacent to that. So it was kind of a package deal studying with Charles.
Yeah, so you're, I think, the first person I've talked to that actually had a history of Prince class in school.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
And
mean, they
it
just
was serious. Yeah, he was a old school memorize everything in hind kind of professor. But it served me well. We learned a lot.
yeah, yes, I imagine it would. I look back now and think, gosh, that would have been so great to have a a good class in history of Prince. Jesus, I had to learn it all on my own, I swear. No, that's not true. I've learned it from a lot of people.
Oh, we're all autodidact to a degree.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So when you got to the Spencer, you weren't faculty. You were in the museum, but did you teach classes other than in the study room?
Well, actually, yes. It was a kind of unique situation. I had a joint appointment. And at that time, in the early 80s, 83, 84, everyone who was a curator had an appointment in the history of art department. And that fell away. But at the time, I was roughly two-thirds museum and one-third art history.
Oh, wow.
So I was tenure track and did become a tenured prof as well. So I was very much, I had my feet in both camps as art history professor, teaching in the routine classroom, and as curator, teaching in the print study room,
Right.
and usually mixing it up as much as possible.
I'm sure. Yeah. But your
Yeah.
courses were obviously, I'm assuming you taught a history of Prince class, but did you teach other subjects?
Not all, well, yes. The first year or two, I got roped into the survey classes,
Of course.
which I opted out of very quickly in order to teach a rotation of history of prints, a print connoisseurship class that I dreamt up, seminars, and a Northern Renaissance survey.
Oh, okay.
So those were kind of my four things in rotation.
Okay.
And the print connoisseurship class was a lot of fun. I tried to make it clear to everyone it wasn't going to be stuffy. It was just a stuffy old word. Basically, the class was about looking at prints, and it was a blast.
I
Yeah.
think Maureen Warren, who's been a guest on Platemark, must have taken the connoisseurship class because she described you pulling out a folder of fake, I think it was either Durer or Rembrandt, and having everyone really talk about why they were fake.
I don't think we have fake Rembrandts per se. We have some really lousy impressions and some very late impressions. So she may have been thinking of that.
Okay.
We have some good impressions too, but
No, yes, of course you do.
but I do remember that I was talking to Jim Berquist once and mentioned that we really could use some Dürer copies because they're so instructive. And I said, "Oh, I have some. I'll send them to you." And about 2 weeks later, in the U.S. mail, I got a standard envelope, tore it open, and of course, it was full of, little Dürer copies, which he had obviously picked up at auction along with other lots and felt he couldn't really sell. And he had prices written on the back of them, which were very modest, and we bought them all.
Oh, nice.
So, in addition to other things that might be considered Dürer copies, all of Marcantonio Raimondi's Life of the Virgin, things like that, we had this lovely group of I don't know 15 or 20 Dürer copies, and some of them are very, very deceptive, and some of them are extremely clunky and crude. And it was obviously instructive for especially a bright student like Maureen to put them out on the table and talk about. What's deceptive, what's just inept, and why were these made? Who is the audience? What was their life as objects? So, yeah, that's probably what Maureen was thinking of,
It
was the
must have
Dürer
been.
copies.
I'm sure it's me not remembering properly what she said to me because I can't remember anything after COVID.
Well, we did look at a lot of Rembrandts too, and we talked about quality issues because our Rembrandts vary in quality significantly,
Right.
from the very good to the not so good.
Right. The Durer issues you mentioned about copies after or what their place in the market was. We're finishing up a section of reproductive prints and the history of prints section of
Hmm.
Platemark. And
Right.
we've been talking about obviously Marcantonio Raimondi and those kinds of people, but the idea that, copies are that's how you learned, and that the idea of a copy wasn't really an idea then. Like this whole
Hmm.
how we look at it now has shifted completely from when it was all being done at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, someone like Holzius is fascinating in that light, paying tribute to Dürer, but building on Dürer, maybe in his mind improving on Dürer a little bit. I mean, those are wonderful conversations to have.
Yeah. Yeah, Goltzius is a favorite for sure. I'm trying to think there was another one that I was thinking of that was so crazy. Oh, the Barocci, the copy after his own painting, the
Ah,
Annunciation.
yeah, yeah,
Like, is that a reproductive print?
sure.
Yes,
I don't know.
but it's done by it's the same hand.
Yeah, exactly.
There's so many ways you can
Autocopy,
go.
self-copying,
Exactly.
self-reference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember when you first knew that prints were a thing?
Well, as a maker, I was captivated when, I don't know, Pasadena Art Museum at age 8, 7 or 8, I made my first linoleum cut in a summer art class. I mean, and the hook was in. There wasn't a lot for years. I did have a wonderful art teacher who was a neighbor. We didn't do prints, but it's all one big ball of wax. And she was a very fine artist herself, named Lee Gerstein, Lee Schnabel at the time. And she taught me and her daughters art. She gave us lessons in her own studio in the afternoons. And those were incredibly instructive and useful. And I always like to think back to those, even though they didn't involve printmaking per se. But I guess when I took the course with Ben Sakaguchi at Pasadena City College, I mean, I wouldn't have done that unless I'd been really interested in printmaking. I needed to take German as a summer class to get into college. So I did that. And while I was up, I said, well, let me take something that well, let's not say recreational, but something that I really felt some real passion for. So I took his printmaking class, and that's when I made my first etchings. It led into my time at Grinnell when I became really aware of the possibility of studying art history as a discipline, and let alone studying art as a discipline.
Right.
So Ben Sakaguchi / Grinnell, certainly by the time I was at the College of Art and Design.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I did a linoleum cut in third grade. I think I still have the scar to show. And my mom was an artist, so we would do potato prints and stuff, but it didn't all register until so much later for me. Like I wasn't paying attention is really what happened.
Do you still have any of those prints?
No, not a one, actually.
Oh, too bad.
I know. Why? Huh? Maybe they're somewhere. I'll have to go digging. That's going to be a real
You have it
deep,
somewhere.
a deep dig.
I have my first linoleum cut somewhere. It was a print of a katydid printed in bright green.
Oh, nice.
And a few years later, I did a print of a elephant beetle, I think. I was a big insect collector at the time. So that was my other love, was insect collecting when I was a kid. So I put them together in my printmaking
Well,
experiences.
you seem like a real Renaissance man. You've got interests all over the place.
Well, it's hard not to, isn't it?
Yes, but there are people who aren't able to, I don't know, have the facility for engaging in all of those areas. Like, I mean, it makes, bug collecting is not so far from print collect. Like they're the same kind of gaining knowledge in a column of information, right?
Well, the totally grok print lore, you have to engage with all kinds of disciplines, of course. So that comes naturally. You have to deal with history of religion and history of culture and politics and you name it, let alone history of art itself, let alone all the technologies involved. So it's a kind of freewheeling enterprise studying prints. That's why I love it.
That's right. That is right. How long have you been retired?
About 3 years now.
Yeah. How's it going?
Oh, just fine. Um, I'm staying plenty busy. That's always the concern you hear about, but I haven't had any problem filling the time between ongoing research problems and having more time to play with printmaking myself, which I always felt I had to keep on the down low at the University of Kansas because the curator, who is also a printmaker, seems like a possible conflict of interest. So all those years, I just made woodcuts, which I could print at home with a wooden spoon, and I just traded with friends. There's certainly no involvement with the market or anything like that. But now I feel a little more open about the fact that I make prints.
Do you mean by conflict of interest that as a curator producing artwork that's saleable, that would be a conflict of interest if you had a sideline as as a selling artist?
Well, I think that would certainly be the case because you're
Yeah.
also making decisions about what to acquire for an art museum.
But you would
So
never
you really
acquire
need
your own work.
no, but getting involved with the print trade is something you just decide to steer clear of when you're a curator, I think. At least in my case, it seemed to be important to maintain that sense of clarity
Right.
that professionally I was a curator, not an artist.
But yes, I'm with you on all of that. But also at the same time, I feel like it's invaluable for a curator to understand the process and have done it.
Right. So, and I had done it. I didn't have to keep doing it
I
while
see.
I was a curator, but I mean, I had studied printmaking as a maker quite a lot before I became a curator, and it's hard to shed that once it's in you. But
Yeah, of course.
my solution was just to discreetly make woodcuts at home, and I would give them to friends, and that was the only life they really had.
We had conversations in the various museums I worked at, not on this line of being an artist too. Come to think of it, a lot of the curators that I worked with at one specific place were also artists. But there was more conversation about collecting and not collecting in the same area that you were the curator of.
Right, right,
So if you're a Rembrandt scholar, not to be competing with the museum in purchasing Rembrandts if you could afford them.
right, right.
Yeah.
Well, I've never been a print collector, so that was never really an issue. I felt that I had plenty of thrills collecting for the art museum itself. I mean, the prints that I have were either acquired by gift, by trade with other artists, which I told our director about, and she said that should be no problem, but I still always shared them with the curatorial committee. And when I would go to Southern Graphics Council, I would sometimes buy works by students. I felt it was important to support young printmakers, so I would do that and sometimes buy things from University of Kansas grad students when they had their annual sale and things like that. So those were modest things that I still have and love, and I always shared them with the museum to be sure that there was no conflict.
Right.
Um, the only case I can think of where there might have been, I bought a duplicate so that both the museum and I had an impression of a print, and there could not really be any issue about that.
Right.
But I'm really not a collector.
I have two duplicates also, come to think of it, and some student work. This one behind me is a Micah student that made the most beautiful, gorgeous prints and doesn't make work anymore. It makes me nuts. Like, ah! Do you remember the work that you waited the longest to find, like to fill a hole in the collection or something that was being made and in process? Like for me, I waited 3 years for a Wangechi Mutu to be completed to buy it.
There's a lot of answers to that. One is when I started, we had one work from Henry Holtzi's beautiful series, The Life of the Virgin. Slowly over the years, we filled it in, so ultimately we had a complete set of the series. Not all consistent, obviously, not printed at the same time, but it's such a fascinating series, and you can teach the heck out of it because of its rich connections to self-referential and historical referential work, contents to the history of printmaking itself. It's one of the first moments, I think, when printmaking became self-conscious, aware of itself. So I felt it was a really interesting series to try to capture in full. So that took many years to complete. Just this last year, a print came on the market I'd looked for most of my career, but not being a curator anymore, I had to say farewell.
Oh no, what was that?
Kate Myers sent me a text from Print Fair and said, "Look what I found."
Oh no.
It's very quirky. It's not the kind of thing one should worry about for a collection, but it's a print that I just love by Melchior Lorck. It's an image of a mole,
Okay.
sort of on a riverbank with a river flowing behind it and a church in the background. And I always thought it was some kind of a parable about the church and blindness, but I have never been able to really do serious research on that print. But I always found it very captivating and wonderful in a way that only a handful of other 16th century prints grabbed me.
Right.
So that finally came on the market, but someone else got it.
Oh, no. And I'm sure the price had changed over the years
Well, God, yes.
a little bit. Ugh. Back to the Goltzius Life of the Virgin. How many are in that series? I forget.
Oh, God, I think it's 8.
8, okay. And, when you say can you talk a little bit about this self-referential part about prince being conscious of themselves? What do you mean?
Well, I mean, Coltius was his own printmaker, of course, so there are things that one would recognize as being by Coltius, but then, of course, one of the prints, each of them ends up being a referral to another professional printmaker in one way or another. So there's one in the style of Dürer, for example. They refer to historical moments in printmaking that are not next to each other, but in the years from Dürer to Coltius's time, about 100 years span. And they refer to, I guess there's 6 altogether now I think of it. They refer to major professional printmakers in that 80 to 100 year period. They make very clear stylistic reference. So in a way, this is like the old college English assignment, write a poem in the style of fill in the blank.
Gotcha.
He was doing Prince in the style of, and at the same time, in a way, critiquing or improving a little bit on each one of them. It's a really fascinating series of prints.
Has there been scholarship? I'm not a Goltzius specialist, although I adore him. Is there literature about what he was thinking and why he just to prove that he could, or
Well, I think there is, but I am at loose ends to be able to cite line and verse. There are many people who've looked at Coltius very closely, people like Walter Melian, for example. And I think it was simply a mode of inserting yourself into history and in a way suggesting that maybe you're a little bigger than history, that you're
ah,
not only able to be historical yourself, but in the process to embrace history and manifest it.
okay.
Um, so it's a rather bold statement and kind of a wonderful one,
It is
really.
wonderful.
I mean, he was a great artist, so what the heck?
He was, but I still am confounded by this idea that he stopped printmaking. He didn't give it up. He stopped and I just wonder because he was what better way to get yourself out? I don't know. It's so confusing. Like, what are you doing? Keep going.
Well, he may have been well enough embedded in his world to not really need to toot his horn too loudly. And I think he may have had failing eyesight
Oh, you
at
think?
the end, which some people think is why he started working in a much larger scale and doing those Pennschildereien, those paintings that are done with pen work and emulate engraving, after all.
Right.
Um, so that's a rather wonderful continuity when you
Yeah.
think about it.
Yeah, no, he's incredible. At the Baltimore Museum, the one that finally came into the collection once we found it at the print fair was one of the Four Disgracers by Holtzius. And we'd had the 3 for a while, and finally there it was. And Rena, who was my boss at the time, and I were like, "Ah, there it is!" Somebody called the people who hold the purse strings, quick! Because when you can only show 3 of a 4, so it's heartbreaking.
Well, we had Dear St. Jerome in the study and a really wonderful impression of Night, Death, and the Devil. The St. Jerome was a very good impression too, but the Night, Death, and the Devil was a world-class impression. But we didn't have Melancholia. We were able to acquire a really deceptive copy of Melancholia. And as far as iconography is concerned, I mean, you can talk about all 3 of those master engravings by Dürer with a good copy if you have to, especially if you have 2 of them in authentic hand of Dürer. It makes it a little more acceptable to segue into Wierix's copy of Melancholia. And then, of course, you can start talking about copies at the same time,
That's right. Very
as
useful.
long as you're up.
Yeah. So the Spencer still doesn't have a Melancholia by Durer's Hand.
No.
Oh, wow. Because your Night, Death, and the Devil is amazing.
Yeah, that's one of the great impressions. That's
Yeah,
a Max Kade print, for example,
of course. When did
as
he
is St. Jerome.
Of course, yeah. The BMA, when we were teaching history of prints for there was a Micah class, my friend True Ludwig, who I work with on the history of prints section of Platemark, brought his class to the BMA study room. And when it got to Rembrandt, we could pull out a pretty good impression of the three crosses. And we
Hmm.
had a heliogravure of the first state so that you could look at both of them as you were doing
Hmm.
with your Melancholia. And, we would never confess to the students that it was a heliogravure because then you'd have to describe what a heliogravure was.
Right.
Basically, a nice copy, right? Or a photographic
Hmm.
copy.
We were able to do the same thing. We had a beautiful impression of the Three Crosses by Rembrandt, and we had a heliogravure of another state. So exactly the same situation. This is truly a segue, but one of the things that surprised me when I first got to the University of Kansas is that the art history department still had boxes of photographs to teach from, which is how one used to study art history. After the lecture, instead of things going online, there would be a box set up in a study room for grad students with cards with photographs affixed to them. And the art history department still had all their old cards. I mean, these are big, large stock, 12 by 14 or something, with reproductions attached to them, glued onto them. And a large number of those were heliogravures, many of them made in Munich or in Leipzig, elsewhere in Germany. So they're very high quality photogravures. And I filched 2 boxes of those out of the trash
Did you really?
and gifted them to Kate Meyer, who may or may not still be caring for them at the Spencer. But I always enjoyed bringing those out when we did print connoisseurship. I said, this is A, how we used to study art history, and B, these are really very high quality reproductions and very useful for studying both the history of reproduction and for a good chance to see prints we don't have in the collection. So
Right.
that was fun.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the thing that's so special about the print room and the department of prints inside a museum, inside of a university, because it, the opportunities for teaching are varied, but so full bodied. You can, as you say, touch on all of these various things with two objects. I mean, you don't do that when you walk in and look at a painting.
Yeah, well, that's very true.
When we were conversing about what to talk about, you mentioned that it would be interesting to talk about some of the projects that you never got around to that you really wanted to do.
Yeah, well, there's really not that many now that I think about it. I realize I prompted you with that, but there are two that I was thinking of. One was would be great fun to do an exhibition of prints and friendship. It always occurred to me, and I always had it on my list of things to do and never got around to it. And you think of all the exchange portfolios out there for starts, where artists would be invited to participate in an exchange. If there are 12 people doing the exchange, there would be 12 prints made total, and everyone would get a copy. And this is often done out of friendship. You think of all the prints in collections that have sometimes very extensive dedications written on them. And that would be fascinating. I mean, it would be very much driven by what collection one's dealing with, because every collection can have a very different set of things that come to mind when one says printmaking and friendship. But certainly things that have rich dedications will be interesting. Something like the Vogel collection that we were one of the recipients of was a collection formed out of friendship with the Vogels and the artists that they were friends with. The Gene Swenson gift at the University of Kansas, which is a collection of objects that were given by artists and critics and friends to Gene Swenson, who was a New York critic and Kansas-born boy, would be of something that we would draw from, for example, if this were to happen at the Spencer. Anyway, that was one of them. The whole idea of, I mean, printmaking, by virtue of being made of multiples, lends itself to sharing I mean, one could be trivial about it and think of all the printmakers who make annual seasonal gift cards for their friends. I mean, Anyway, that was one idea that never happened because maybe it wasn't that good of an idea. Um, Another one, which is probably didn't happen because I never really thought it through completely, would be to look at the handful of artists in the 16th century who were kind of printmakers by avocation. And specifically, I was thinking of Dirk Vellert, who's one of my favorite printmakers, who was a glass painter by trade. And he made 20 some etchings, something like that. And that's it. And they're wonderful idiosyncratic etchings. One has the feeling that since they weren't his bread and butter, the way that glass painting was, glass painting design, that he could stretch a little bit. And I kind of have the same feeling about Master H.L. Hans Leinberger, who's a marvelous German Renaissance limewood sculptor. So he was primarily a sculptor. He made a handful of prints, and they are also marvelous and idiosyncratic. And my thought was, to look and see who else. I mean, Melchior Lorck does come to mind at his Lowly Mole. He made many more prints than the other two, but many of them were woodcuts and woodcut designs. His intaglio prints are not very many in number. So one of the kind of daydream exhibitions was to do, I mean, in a way, it was very self-serving because the thought was how much fun would I have with these three printmakers in the same room, just looking at them and thinking about them. But I do think it would be an engaging exhibition idea, and there might be something more to the idea of printmakers who weren't earning their keep as printmakers, but were making marvelous prints anyway, because they couldn't resist or because who knows why. We don't know why.
I like
Very,
it. But like that
very
idea
quirky.
of an artist participating in the two disciplines or four or five, however many, is a through line that I think printmaking has all the way through, right? I mean, part of my whole shtick with Hayter and the Atelier 17 was that
Oh,
all of
yeah.
those artists were, painters or sculptors, and they flip back and forth between printmaking and those other disciplines, bouncing off of each other, and that it was all growing together in the same line, and that printmaking shouldn't be over here in some corner.
Yeah, well, Hayter's a wonderful example of that.
Yeah. Did the Spencer have much Hayter or Atelier 17 work?
A handful, but I wouldn't say it's a major trove.
Right.
There are some artist books by Atelier 17 artists, and we have a few works by Hayter himself, but we don't have a lot of things by
Okay.
Hayter, surprisingly. So I wouldn't say it's a major vein in the collection,
Okay. I'm always curious. Because the
unless things have changed.
right. Well, right. I'll just call Kate. Don't worry. I'll ask her.
Yeah,
The
ask
the
Kate.
um the centenary of the founding of the Atelier is coming up really soon. It was founded in I think it was the fall of 1927. So if one were to pitch an anniversary exhibition, I'm always curious about places that would be a natural fit for such an exhibition to come through, if Atelier
Mhm.
17 was a strength and something that you'd focused on.
Are there many plans for that anniversary?
It's a pipe dream in my and Christina Weil's head at the moment.
Well, maybe it will be realized.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So you may not know about me that when I was departing the BMA that I was working on a big hater show. And when the new director came and cleaned house, the show got canceled. So I have this, kind of in my back pocket all the
Yeah,
time.
I think I was aware that that was an interest of yours.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Christina and I have been, working on and off together about what could be done, and how in the world do we find a place to host us, because neither of us has institutional backing at the moment, and you know sort of
Yeah.
a problem. Because if you say, hey, I want to do the show, and you have to get loans from 25 different institutions, it's more than two
Yeah,
people can
you'd
handle.
have to, I think, effectively cast yourself as a guest curator for an institution that was willing to take it on with you.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, good luck finding one of those. Oh, did you ever have in your mind The one object from the museum that would have been a lovely retirement gift for you?
Well, I was very happy to get our Dirk Vellet print of Drummer and Child outside of a city. Well, that would have been a wonderful gift. I love that print.
Okay. All right.
One
Fair
of my
enough.
favorite things in the collection, one of the things that I'm happiest about having brought into the collection.
Yeah.
I mean, I think certainly brought many more important prints into the collection, but I felt a very close connection with that one, in part because I lived in Belgium for 2 years and I worked in the city of Antwerp almost daily. And Vellet was one of the great Antwerp artists of the generation of Quentin Metzies and others who are known primarily as painters. So it was something that was very close to my heart. A beautiful little print of a drummer and child walking along together outside of a city.
Nice.
Yeah, very beautiful print. For example, that
For
would have been a
example,
nice
right. There's so many.
one. I
My
do not think I would have accepted it, though.
Oh, of
I
course not. Of
would
course
have said,
not.
you take care of this,
Yeah.
please.
No, 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 no. Yes. No, yes, of course, it would never happen. Surely
Well, it's
there's
easy to
one.
confess when you're retired.
Yeah, exactly.
Then if something goes missing, I had no access to it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. My retirement gift from the National Gallery would have been a gorgeous watercolor by John Ruskin, of all things.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. It was just
Fair enough.
lovely. A lovely thing. That was it. I know this is going to embarrass you, but all of us probably can point to the one professor who sucked us in to either art history or prints specifically. But I think you're that person for a lot of people.
Could well be. I mean, I taught history of prints and print connoisseurship for 34 years. And a lot of students went through our print study room, and many of them made prints as well. Both John Toulour and I, and later Michael Krieger and I, co-taught courses where we would spend every other lecture or half of a lecture in the studios making prints, and the other half in the museum studying prints. So we cultivated an awful lot of really wonderful students who came both from the studio end of things and from the art history end of things, or from other disciplines as well. So I do have a long list of interns or students who work closely with me in the museum, and I won't rattle it off right now, but it's long, and it's something that gives me great pride.
As well it should. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a handful of curators that are still active or who retired relatively recently, came to the museum and studied with me, but also curators in other disciplines, people like Jessica Kirchhoff, who's now at Detroit studying arms and armor, her specialty. But she worked really closely with me as well. So there are students who are continuing in the print world and who are continuing in other aspects of art history of the arts who came through the program, who had experiences in the print study room, and for whom that was, I think, formative. And I'm very proud of that and very happy about it.
I think you
So
should
thanks for
be.
reminding me of it.
I thought you might just clamp down in embarrassment or something. It wasn't until I met you and Kate that I realized what was going on at the Spencer. And I
Mhm.
feel like, I don't know if the University of Kansas fronts you guys as a thing that should be held up as why you should go there, but they should, because it doesn't happen everywhere. Not every school has the capability or the staff that's passionate or the collection to back it up. It sounds like a little print nirvana out there in Lawrence.
Well, first of all, it's a very major part of the collection. One should say that the collection itself is rather comprehensive, and people who come to Lawrence, Kansas, are often surprised by what they find. Say, my God, a Rossetti, my God, Tillman Riemenschneider, and let alone what's in the print study room. So, but the print room has a very large percentage of great things in the collection. 25,000 some prints. And I guess what do I want to say about this? In recent years, meaning in the last 15, certainly last 10 years that I was there is a major push to integrate the museum into the curriculum across campus. This, of course, is not unique to the Spencer Museum. Many museums have gone this route. But we were extremely successful at it, both because of the vision of the directors, especially the current director, because of the very dedicated staff, not just curatorial staff, but people in the education department and other departments, in the art history department as well. We were able to find purchase in many, many departments across the campus, not just history of art, but French and Italian, or women's studies, or pharmacology, things you wouldn't expect. The professors would pre-associate with Kate and myself and others in the museum. Here's what I want to teach. Here's the kind of content I want to deal with. And we'd brainstorm and say, well, you know what we have? You know what might be interesting? Could you use this? And they would develop a curriculum that drew very heavily from the museum, and especially heavily from the works on paper department. So prints, drawings, and photographs find their ways into the curriculum a rather intensive fashion. And of course, Kate has spent much of her, we're talking about Kate Meyer, who's the current curator at the Spencer Museum of Art, works on paper, spends much of her time working with colleagues across campus and teaching directly from the collection in this kind of manner. So it's something that we pride ourselves on, and it does make the Spencer Museum a little bit of a mecca, a little bit special for the ways that we're able to offer things up across disciplines.
When I was talking to James Wen, who's at Madison, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, their museum, the Chazen, as you know, he said that they consider themselves to be the largest, basically the largest classroom on campus. I mean, arts classroom, I guess, but that the resources they had in the collection itself and the museum spaces and everything, like it's a special thing. And I commend you guys for being such good cheerleaders for the whole situation, because it's a great way to learn, I think.
Well, and it's always interesting to hear about people who had that experience, whether at the Spencer or at the Chazen or other academic museums, which are a special class among themselves, and go on with their careers and realize in retrospect they never knew what they had when they were in college and had access to these marvelous collections. Not everyone can boast that, but certainly most of the major university art museum collections in the States have got a significant print collection. Whether it's Bloomington or Oberlin or Berkeley, or the Ivy League schools, the Chazen, et cetera. We're able to share these things in a way that's perhaps more intimate and meaningful than a large city museum usually can.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I went to the College of Worcester in Ohio, and there is a collection there that's named after John Taylor Arms, although it wasn't his collection. It was
Oh, that's right.
he was sort of the prime focus in his orbit, and I knew that existed there, but I never saw any of it. I don't know where it was kept or anything. And I mean, I wasn't into prints at that point. I was heading at American painting. What was I thinking? Um, but it's there, and so I don't know how to encourage students to sort of dig and see what's available at their institution, but that's what I'm advocating for. Go find out, people. It's such a special thing, really. When you find that professor that, like, when I said to my father, I want to study art history, but it was because of this person. And I was like, oh my God, if I can ever be that passionate about any topic ever, it's going to be art. And that's the model of that kind of passion right there. And, whether I teach or not, it was life changing for me.
Well, I think my experience with Stephen Foster was like that, studying at University of Iowa. And it brought me into contact with objects in an important way because, and this is where I had to be cautious because I'm not really sure if this is true, but I did a term paper on the Dada magazine. And the University of Iowa had almost a complete set of Dada magazine in the rare book room. I think Stephen Foster knew about this, but I'm not certain. I did a term paper drawing heavily from those Dada magazines and working in the library with those wonderful works on paper, the Dada magazines, was a marvelous experience. And maybe more than I usually acknowledge, may have been behind my growing love of works on paper and ultimate decision to go in that route professionally. It was a wonderful experience.
For sure. And I think sometimes things like that aren't considered art, quote unquote. But when they talk about working with primary material, I mean, you couldn't get more primary than working with the journal that is the art, right?
No, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, those are great. I love those. But so you're still doing research on something?
Last year, I was invited to write an essay on the prints of a Belgian artist named Albert Bertsoen, who was an artist in Ghent who's primarily known as a painter, but he was a great printmaker, and they wanted someone to write on the print. So they invited me to do that, which I was happy to do. So I wrote an essay that took about a year to do for this exhibition and catalog coming out of Ghent. It's available in both Flemish and in French, but not in English.
Oh, gosh.
um, but a wonderful production. And I'm currently very interested in the prints by another Belgian printmaker named Walter Voss, who's not well known, but a very interesting printmaker. He's primarily a painter. He's considered primarily a painter. I'm not sure that he really was primarily a painter, who specialized in still lives and portraits. To my eye, not the most exciting works of art, but his prints are spectacular, I find. He made over 360 prints, and they've never been studied.
What?
That's not true. They've been published here and there. Typically, a catalog on the artist will include his paintings and maybe some drawings and mention prints, maybe illustrate one, but they tend not to deal with his prints. And so I'm looking into those with great interest. He was a rough contemporary of James Ensor, who's one of my real heroes, an Antwerp artist again. He was active for quite a long time, and in the years around World War I, his prints took an interesting turn and became almost hallucinatory in nature. I found some important documents, and I'm trying to see as much as I can. When I was living in Belgium, I looked at everything I could find of his, just with a thought towards future research. And here it is, the future, and I have time to do it. So that's one of the projects I'm currently dealing with, is the Prince of Walter Voss. I have no idea where it's going to go.
I was gonna say. But like if you for you in Estes Park, Colorado, when you decide to study as somebody who's lesser studied than others, do you get up and go to Europe, or like how do you find your resources from Colorado?
I've got a nice library. It's sitting behind me.
Yes, you are a true scholar, Steve.
And I mean, in the past, I always took notes and made photocopies and took photographs of things that I found interesting that I thought I might want to work with someday. So
Oh,
I've got that stuff,
brills.
but it's always incomplete. So in this case, I had notes and photographs. I went out and bought the few books on the antiquarian market that have to do with Walter Voss. There's very few. And I tracked down through my previous connections and knowledge of how things go in Antwerp, tracked down some documents that are useful. And what I don't have is the objects. And depending on where this project goes, I may indeed have to run off to Antwerp and look at things in detail, but because they're not in U.S. collections as far as I can tell. There are
Right.
very
Yeah.
few around. I think the Getty has one of the famous ones. And that may be it.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Which is a scene of insects invading the city of Antwerp. But yeah, it's a very interesting print with
Nice.
cicadas and things in the sky descending on the city of Antwerp.
Oh, wow.
And it's, or locusts rather, the other kind of locust, the grasshopper kind of locust, not the cicada kind of locust. That's a reference to the invasion of Antwerp during World War One. Yeah.
Wow. So you'll pull this together because you have an interest in it, but then you'll pitch it as an article to a journal, or do you?
Oh, I think that's probably the only way it could go.
Right.
It would be fun to do a monograph, but I have absolutely no idea. What are the visible means of support for that? I don't know.
Yeah, there should be like some consortium of, curators who have great, interesting projects, but don't have institutional backing, like someone's hater
One
project.
would approach the Flemish community or something like that and see
Yeah,
if they
there you
would
go.
want to subsidize something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think an article might be a very good way to go.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. When did you live in Belgium?
Well, when I was doing my dissertation research in the early 80s, I had a Belgian American Education Foundation grant, which took me to Belgium for a year to do research on the Master of Frankfurt and his workshop. And the dollar was very good at that time, and I stretched it to 2 years.
Wow.
So I was frugal and lived in Belgium for 2 years. That was just prior to my going off to Yale in '82.
Right. I haven't interviewed Dick Field, and people probably know who he is, but could you tell us about Mr. Field? Because he's one of the sort of star curators in the print world.
Well, he's a remarkable person. Dick and I hit it off immediately. So this is probably 1981, something like that, when he interviewed me. Pre-internet, we agreed by snail mail on a date to have a phone interview because I could not afford to come to the United States for interviews. I'd bombed on all kinds of attempts to get teaching positions back in the States. So I applied to this curious internship at the Yale University Art Gallery. We agreed on a time to have a phone call. I went to the train station to make an international phone call at such and such an hour. And we had a very nice conversation. It worked. We managed to get our calendars lined up properly and deal with the crazy phone system in Belgium. And we talked about the BAM brothers and about the possibilities of doing a BAM exhibition. And we had a very engaging conversation, and he offered me the position. So that brought me back to the States, and I worked with Dick for a full year. We formed quite a good friendship. He's a specialist in 15th century woodcut, in monotypes of Gauguin, and in the prints of Jasper Johns, and many other things. But those are his three major research areas. He's still active, and I don't know what more I can tell you about him. He has a wonderful sense of humor and is playful, sometimes dangerously so. And he'll hear this and say, "What does he mean by that?" And I won't tell because he knows. But yeah, Dick was a wonderful mentor and remained a mentor throughout my career and still is a mentor in my retirement.
For listeners, when you are studying a specific artist, and if they have made enough prints and have gotten enough buzz, there will be a book written that lists every print in order. It's called a catalog raisonné, and Dick is the author of the Jasper Johns catalog raisonné. So when you are looking for a certain print, you go by field numbers, and so now you know who Field is.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Do you have a catalog raisonné out there? Goddard, 1, 2?
No.
No?
There are no G numbers out there.
No G numbers. There's
Yeah.
no S numbers either.
Then maybe Walter Voss will have a G number someday. I don't know.
There you go. If you need help, I'll help. That sounds like fun. Other idea that struck me when you were talking about Dick as a mentor is a show. And I feel like I had a friend who did a show like this where the prints were mentor-mentee. So it could be teacher-student, but it could also be somebody you looked up to who, you took something from, or that could be a really good pairing sort of show too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never had coursework with Dick Field, and some of the interns did, I believe, at Yale. I remember preparing for that internship. I was working at a Belgian Institute for the Study of Flemish Primitives, to put it into translation, and they had a good library. And when I knew that I had the position, I went to the library and I went through every volume of Holstein, which, speaking of catalogues raisonné, is a huge catalog raisonné of 16th and 17th century prints from the Low Countries in Germany. I just went through page by page and
It's like 40 volumes.
And tried to get them into my visual memory.
God.
And it's a great experience. I mean, I learned a lot just by looking, and I suppose it did get me in the right frame of mind for dealing with prints for a full year at Yale.
Oh my god. But Holstein illustrations are not great. Like, yeah.
No,
Yeah.
but they're comprehensive.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
I mean, it gives you a good idea of what was made,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, it's for listeners, it's I don't know how many volumes, but I feel like it was at least 40. And sometimes the volumes would be a
Yeah, at
single
least
artist.
70.
Yeah, yeah. It's an arm's width on a shelf. Sometimes a single volume is on a single artist, but sometimes it runs, CZ to DH or something, and you get all the artists listed in
Well,
between.
it's
And it
still being produced. It's still being cranked out.
right, yeah. And
The
there's
quote unquote new
the new
Holstein.
Holstein,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and I think, are they just continuing on with artists they hadn't touched, or they actually they're redoing some of them, right?
I think they're redoing some of them,
Yeah,
revisiting. Mhm.
yeah, yeah. Because the old Holstein isn't really that helpful. I mean, like it's the states aren't usually right, or they don't have states at all, or I don't know. I didn't ever find it really very
That's another tie into something that I was involved with at the University of Kansas and at the Print Council of America was coming up with a online index to print catalogs raisonné, which your listeners can find by going to Print Council of America website and clicking the tab for oeuvre catalogs.
yeah.
But when I was president of Print Council, that's one of the things that we looked at was taking Tim Rigg's marvelous hard copy of Index to Print Catalogs raisonné and expanding it in perpetuity as a database, which is so it would take another hour to go through all that, but it was quite a history, but something that we undertook at the University of Kansas and that now is being carried on independently of Kansas.
Right.
If you're looking for a print catalog for a given artist, that's the way you can find it most easily.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, I always wanted. Sometimes I couldn't tell if there are 4 or 5 catalogs that have been done on a certain artist, like Manet or whoever. Like, which one is the one you're supposed to go for? Like, I always wanted there to be a little asterisk, like this is the one that you should really primarily use.
Well, yeah, there's probably not a great answer for that, but the one thing I can say is that we organized the database in the same way that Tim Riggs organized his book, which is to give the most recent one at the bottom. So if you look at it as a list, the most recent scholarship is identifiable.
Right. Right.
Doesn't mean it's the best,
Exactly.
but it often means it's the most comprehensive because these things tend to be additive.
Right.
But that's the most I can say about that.
Right. Yeah, and now a lot of the catalog raisonnés are online only, like the miraculously wonderful Whistler catalog that's out of the University of Glasgow, which
Mm-hmm.
not only tells you about the various impressions of a certain image, but shows you pictures and tells you where they are.
Right, or the Daumier Register is another one that's fantastic.
The Daumier Register is also good. It has translations in there too, which is handy for some of us.
It is, yeah.
Prints about jelly beans. Go. Yeah. So that takes a special mind to work on a catalog raisonné, I think. I mean, print curators are minutia people anyway, but that's a higher level order there.
Well, you've got to be a detail person, that's for sure.
Yeah. And you have to be a voracious and curious learner, really, in prints.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And have access to all kinds of resources.
Right.
Like, I mean, pictorial, you have to have access to the prints themselves because you have to be able to compare multiple impressions of the same composition. And I don't know, probably have a remarkable visual memory.
Yeah, no, I think you do, because I mean, it's easy to see that your impression of Night, Death, and the Devil is better than the one we had at Baltimore. But boy, there are shades of gray in between, and having that sort of reference flip of images in your brain is important. Sounds minutia-ish, though.
Now, I was always amazed by the people of the early 20th, late 19th century who worked on painting catalogs raisonné without photographs.
Yeah.
I mean, the people like Max J. Friedlander, who was able to, I mean, he did work from photographs also, but was able to compare things purely by memory
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Remarkable. Lost skill, I think, in many ways.
Exactly. Well, we all have the attention span of a flea now, so no, we're doomed.
We all have Google Images now as well.
Yeah, that reverse Google image was very handy when I was cataloging weird and arcane things that I didn't quite know what they were. Like, oh, there it is in Leipzig. The internet changed everything for catalogers.
And everyone else.
Yes, and everyone else. That is true. I also think a good exhibition would be all of those holiday cards that the artists made and mailed to all the museums. Because we had a bunch, and there were a lot in a box that Jay Fisher would just slide them into this little box in the back and never touch them. So you'd go through periodically and say, "Oh, look, there's 10 hater Christmas cards in there. Let's give them numbers." And they were just charming. And Hader that's where he would experiment because it was, kind of no harm, no foul. Like he could do whatever and it'd be tiny. And, I think that was a place where people had fun.
Well, and those are often kind of household presses, not done in a studio, but done on the small scale at home. I'm kind of making this up, but the ones I can think of, I know were printmakers who had their own little press at home and would crank out their seasonal greetings that way.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's right. Yeah, I just got one yesterday, day before yesterday I'm on Evan Lindquist's list. Yeah, they're always gorgeous, beautiful engravings. They're lovely. I feel very fortunate. All right. Well, Steve, unless you have more anecdotes for us, I think we should wrap it up.
I know we could talk about lots more, but
it's true.
You can come back for chapter 2 if you feel like we've neglected anything that I can comment on intelligently.
Yeah, yes, it's true. Print people can talk for a long time. It is very true. All right. Well, thank you for coming on Platemark. It's been a pleasure. And I would love to circle back with you in a little while and do some more talking.
Great. Well, thanks so much for thinking of me and allowing me to speak to you all on Platemark. And perhaps until next time.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Platemark with Steve Goddard. He was a delight to talk to, and I'm so glad he was able to come on the show. I want to thank Steve for being a willing interviewee, and I also, as usual, need to thank Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. As I mentioned at the top, any images Steve and I talk about are over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. There are other things over there too, as you well know, because I talk about them all the time. So I won't do it here. I think that's it. We'll see you next time.